Section 7 of Imperialism and World Politics, Part 2 of 4, by Parker Thomas Moon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Alistair. Chapter 10c, North Africa and the Great Powers. Subsection, Italy's vital interest in Libya. The seizure of Morocco by France was in more than one way an indirect cause of the Great War. Not only did it exacerbate Franco-German and Anglo-German relations, it also precipitated the Turco-Italian War of 1911, which led to the Balkan War of 1912, which in turn led to the Sarajevo crisis and the catastrophe of 1914. It is with the Turco-Italian War that we now propose to deal. That Italian imperialists should have looked hungrily upon the littoral of Africa, just across the Mediterranean from Italy, was almost inevitable, not only because of the geographic proximity, but also because in these lands Italians outnumbered other Europeans, and above all, because ancient Rome had once been mistress of North Africa. Soon after Italy had become a united nation in the 19th century, Italians turned their eyes toward Tunis, ancient Carthage, only to see France carry off this prize in 1881, with lordly disregard of Italian aspirations. Italy, as we have seen, promptly allied herself with the enemies of France in the Triple Alliance of 1882, and looked elsewhere for colonies. Just east of Tunis, between that country and Egypt, lay two Turkish provinces, Tripolitania and Cyrenaica, much larger than Tunis, if less valuable. These, at any rate, Italy would secure for herself. This time Italian statesmen took pains to secure promises of support from the other great powers. From Germany, a pledge was obtained, in 1887, of armed assistance to prevent France from taking Tripoli. Great Britain and Austria-Hungary also promised, in the Mediterranean Agreement of 1887, to oppose any attempt of France to extend her domination on the northern coast of Africa. Spain too came to an agreement. But these were negative pledges, not positive approvals of Italy's designs, nor did a favourable opportunity soon arise for Italian seizure of the coveted lands. Italy waited. 13 years later, Italy was able to strengthen her secret agreements by obtaining, in December 1900, a promise from France to refrain from opposing Italian ambitions in Tripoli and Cyrenaica if Italy would be equally considerate as regards French interests in Morocco. England was also favourable. In fact, Lord Salisbury in 1890 had suggested that to prevent the Mediterranean from becoming a French lake, Italy should take Tripoli, but not just then. To make assurance doubly sure, the Italian government, in renewing the Triple Alliance in 1902, obtained not only the pledge of German military support in case French aggression should move Italy to undertake action in Tripolitania and Cyrenaica, but also from Austria-Hungary a declaration that no opposition would be offered to Italian measures in these provinces. Russia's consent was purchased by the secret Pact of Racconigi, October 24, 1909, in exchange for Italian benevolence regarding the Dardanelles. Italy now had secret agreements with all the other great powers of Europe. Pending a favourable opportunity for armed conquest, the Italians proceeded with what is known as peaceful penetration of Tripoli and Cyrenaica. Leading Italian banks, notably the Banca d'Italia and the Banca di Roma, invested money in olive oil and soap factories, olive groves and farms, sponge fisheries, steamboats, and other business enterprises in the Promised Land. Italian newspapers grew amazingly optimistic regarding the potential grain fields, the potential cotton plantations, the potential phosphate and sulphur mines, the potential cattle ranches, which would be added to Italy's national wealth. As the time for annexation drew near, atrocities such as the kidnapping of an Italian girl and insults to the Italian flag aroused the Italian public to the required pitch of warlike enthusiasm. In July 1911, the Morocco crisis afforded the long-desired opportunity. In August, Italy quietly informed the great powers that she intended to restore order in Tripoli. The Italian army was made ready. Then, on September 28, 1911, Italy took the final step by sending to Turkey one of the most amazing ultimatums in the annals of diplomacy. The Italian note of September 28th declared that the
state of disorder and neglect in which Tripoli and Cyrenaica are left by Turkey
must come to an end. This was, for Italy,
a vital interest of the very first order.
It may have been vital for the Banca di Roma and the Banca d'Italia, but what difference the welfare of 500,000 Arabs, mixed with Berber and Negro, in the Tripolitanian deserts made to Italy as a whole, must be left to the reader's imagination. The note continued in like exaggerated vein to say that all Italian business enterprises
constantly encounter a systematic opposition of the most obstinate and unwarranted kind,
and to complain of the
agitation prevailing against Italian subjects,
and the
arrival at Tripoli of Ottoman military transports.
And now comes the delightful denouement.
The Italian government, therefore, finding itself forced to think of its guardianship of its dignity and interests,
note the combination, national prestige and business interests,
has decided to proceed to the military occupation of Tripoli and Cyrenaica.
This in itself would be ironic, in view of the secret intrigues which the Italian government had been conducting for a generation to prepare for the conquest, but the supreme touch of irony was added by a suave request that Turkey give orders so that the Italian invasion may meet with no opposition. Turkey replied the next day that anything short of territorial cession would be granted if Italy would but specify what reforms were desired. But Italy declared war. Secretly, through Germany, Italy offered to be content with the occupation of Tripoli on terms resembling the Austrian occupation of Bosnia, but before an agreement could be reached, Italian troops had taken the town of Tripoli, and the Italian public was so aroused that nothing short of annexation, by decree of November 5th, would suffice. It was not difficult to capture the ports on the Tripolitanian coast, but to subdue the Arabs in the interior, or bring Turkey to terms, proved unexpectedly difficult. The war dragged on into 1912. Italy occupied some of the Aegean islands, and twice attacked the Dardanelles, but not until October 1912 was peace concluded, and only then because Turkey was about to engage in war with the Balkan nations, to which the Turco-Italian War had offered an opportunity for attack on Turkey. Italy emerged from the war with Tripoli and Cyrenaica in her possession, though Turkey never formally recognised Italian annexation of these provinces until the Treaty of Lausanne of 1923. In addition, Italian troops occupied the group of small islands known as the Dodecanesia. Ever mindful of the imperial Roman tradition, Italy applied to Tripolitania and Cyrenaica the old Roman name of Libya, Libya Italiana, but Libya Italiana was not the prosperous province that Roman Libya had been. Since Roman days, much of the colony had become uninhabited desert. Moreover, the Arab and Berber tribes of the interior fiercely opposed Italian rule. Pacification by extermination may be a very unfair description of Italy's policy toward these tribes, but it suggests the difficulties of Italian conquest. During the Great War of 1914, Turkish and German officers encouraged and aided the tribesmen in an effort to drive the Italians into the sea, and at the close of the war, Italy held only some of the coast districts. But in 1919, the Italian government adopted a new policy of granting the natives equal citizenship with Italians, of governing, so far as possible, through the native chiefs, and of granting the natives representation in a colonial parliament, one for Tripolitania, one for Cyrenaica. By this means, most of the chiefs were more or less successfully conciliated, but Italian rule was by no means solid or secure. The war by which Italy won Libya is said to have cost over $200 million, and after the war Italy continued to pay heavy military expenses. Each year Italy had to contribute a large sum. In 1922 through 1923 it was 203 million lira, to make good the difference between heavy expenditures and small revenues in Libya. Altogether, it was estimated that Libya had cost Italy 3 billion lira, about $600 million, up to 1924. Was it worth the price? The colony is large enough, 580,000 square metres, and if what Italian newspapers had said of Tripoli before the conquest were true, it would have been valuable enough. But after the conquest, Italy discovered that Libya was a relatively barren country. A large part of the interior was actual desert, where shifting sands mocked the imperialist. Other parts were suitable only for grazing. There were, to be sure, some regions, particularly along the coast, where olive, palm and fruit trees were grown, but the value of their products was small. Unfortunately for Italy, the caravan trade from the Sahara and the Sudan, formerly passing through Tripoli, was diverted to Egypt and Tunis, and even the extension of Italian frontiers, after the war, at the expense of Tunis and Egypt, giving Italy control of important caravan routes, did not entirely remedy the situation. Moreover, the scanty population of 800,000, little more than one person to the square mile, was an additional handicap to economic development. The total exports, chiefly hides and wool, were worth only 4,774,147 lira in 1912, and actually declined after the conquest to 4,493,638 lira in 1914. Later they recovered and in 1923 reached the figure of 39,735,358 lira, but as the exchange value of the lira had fallen, this sum should be divided by about 4. The imports, thanks to Italian investments and expenditures, increased after the conquest, and were many times larger than the exports. Even so, the total commerce was only 201,630,575 lira in 1921, less than the annual deficit paid directly by Italy in the colonial budget. But the Banca d'Italia and the Banca di Roma, through branches in the colony, may have made considerable profits. And, above all, Italian patriotism exulted in the possession of a colony so large, albeit so costly. Mussolini, moreover, balanced the colonial budget. Subsection: The Entering Wedge in Egypt. Great Britain obtained what is generally, though mistakenly, considered the chief prize in North Africa, namely Egypt. Large as it appears on the map, one should remember that the real Egypt is merely a narrow river valley and delta, only 12,000 square miles in area, densely settled by 14 million people. The rest, the 370,000 square miles of desert, is unimportant save on the map. When the age of imperialism dawned on Europe, Egypt was a province of the Ottoman Empire, paying tribute to the Turkish Sultan, ruled by the Sultan's representative, a governor or pasha. France, rather than Britain, seemed the most interested European power. French interest was partly due to the Napoleonic tradition. Had not Napoleon declared,
"Really, to destroy England, we must make ourselves masters of Egypt"?
And had he not compelled the pyramids, for a fleeting moment at least, to bow to the glory of France? As every schoolboy knows, Napoleon had to flee from Egypt in defeat, but in after years French interest remained lively. It was to France that the ambitious Mehemet Ali, Pasha of Egypt from 1806 to 1849, turned to advisers to aid him in promoting technical education and irrigation. It was to the Frenchman de Lesseps that a later Pasha granted a concession to dig a canal through the Isthmus of Suez. England became interested after the canal was opened. As in the case of Tunis, or of Morocco, the entering wedge for imperialism in Egypt was finance, and the wedge was driven in because of the reckless extravagance of the ruler. The ruler, in this instance, was Ismail Pasha, 1863 through 1879, a squat and rather stout red-bearded gentleman with a passion for power and for European culture. In 12 years he spent $500 million. Some of it was well expended, on schools, on canals and railways, and telegraphs, on harbours and on public buildings. He bought up-to-date ironclads for his navy. He poured out money to conquer the Sudan. Hoping to obtain European favour, he generously sent 1,200 Nubian soldiers to help the French establish an empire for Maximilian in Mexico. When the Suez Canal, in which he invested $80 million, was opened in 1869, he entertained the Emperor of Austria and the Empress Eugenie of France and other European luminaries in truly royal style. He even built a special road from Cairo out to the pyramids and the Sphinx for the convenience of his guests, and a special palace for a ball at the terminus of the canal in the town called Ismailia in his honour. By increasing his annual tribute to the Turkish Sultan, he obtained the more dignified title of Khedive instead of Pasha, and the right of succession by primogeniture for his heirs. Meanwhile, he was buying up land in Egypt from private owners until he had increased his personal estate to 916,000 acres. All this cost money. Though he imposed crushing taxes on the peasantry, Ismail got into embarrassing financial straits, especially when the price of Egyptian cotton, which had soared high during the American Civil War, suddenly dropped after the war, causing terrible suffering in Egypt. But European bankers were accommodating. Year after year he added to the foreign debt, which had been only £3,292,800 sterling at his accession, but reached a total of £68,497,160 sterling after 10 years of his extravagance. As his credit weakened, he had to sell his bonds for less cash. For example, he received less than 20 millions cash for 7% bonds whose face value was 32 millions in 1873. Short-term treasury bonds bearing 20% interest could be sold in 1875 for only a quarter of their face value. To stave off ruin, he offered to sell, to French interests, the 176,602 shares he held in the Suez Canal Company. These, as we have previously explained, were bought up hastily by Disraeli for £3,680,000 sterling in 1875, for Disraeli believed that the canal was
a highway to our Indian Empire.
But even this sum was not enough. In response to Ismail's appeal for further loans, the British cabinet sent Mr. Stephen Cave to investigate Egypt's finances in 1875. Cave's report, asserting the economic wealth of Egypt, but recommending sounder financial methods, resulted in the establishment the following year of an international debt commission, the Caisse de la Dette Publique, comprising representatives of England, France, Italy, and Austria. All existing loans were to be consolidated into a general debt of £91 million sterling, bearing 7%. Revenues sufficient to bear the charges on this debt were to be received directly by the Caisse, and no new loans were to be issued without its consent. Dissatisfied with this arrangement, the British and French bondholders induced the Khedive to appoint an Englishman to take charge of the revenue and a Frenchman to audit expenditures. A bad Nile and a famine year, however, so reduced revenues that interest payments could not be met in 1878, and the Khedive proposed to reduce the rate of interest. Such a proposal, naturally, was most unwelcome to the bondholders. They insisted on the appointment of a commission of 6 Europeans and 1 Egyptian to investigate the situation. The commission proposed wholesale reforms, a budget system, tax reform, cession of the Khedive's personal property to the state. Helplessly, Ismail tried to placate his creditors by appointing a Christian premier, Nubar Pasha, with an Englishman, Wilson, as finance minister, and a Frenchman, de Blinière, as Minister of Public Works. But, dreading the proposed reforms, and knowing well that landowners would support him in resisting heavier taxation, and army officers in opposing economy, Ismail, in April 1879, discharged his European ministers, appointed a new cabinet, and announced that he would resume his prerogatives and protect the privileges of the upper classes. Loudly the foreign bondholders protested. Vainly the French and British governments remonstrated. And the two Western powers did take joint action. First, they asked Ismail to resign. When he refused, they persuaded the Turkish Sultan to depose him. The Sultan was willing enough to reassert his authority over an almost independent vassal. Ismail departed on his yacht with the favourites of his harem and such jewels and funds as he could hastily gather together. The new Khedive, Tawfiq Pasha, was compelled to revive the Anglo-French financial control and was warned that the establishment in Egypt of political influence on the part of any other power in competition with that of England and France would not be tolerated. The dual control by France and England lasted from 1879 to 1883. A budget system was established, heavier taxes were laid on the wealthy landowners, and the crushing burdens on the peasants were lightened. and although the interest on the debt had been lowered to 4%, there seemed to be good reason for believing that if this could be paid regularly, the foreign loans to Egypt would still prove profitable investments, since the price paid for the bonds had been very low. Trouble, however, arose soon. In 1881, Taufik summoned an assembly of notables, a sort of aristocratic parliament, to meet, and the notables promptly demanded the ordinary parliamentary right to control the expenditure of at least that part, about half of the revenue, which was not required for debt service. To this, France and England replied in a joint note, January 8th, 1882, announcing their intention of supporting the Khedive's authority. Parliamentary rule, apparently, was not for Egypt. More than a note, however, seemed to be needed, in view of the fact that, to save money, the Anglo-French advisers had insisted on the dismissal of about 2,500 Egyptian army officers on half pay, besides other unpopular reforms, and had thus called into life a powerful nationalist anti-European agitation led by Colonel Ahmed Arabi. There was a danger that Arabi's followers would become strong enough to insist on Egypt for the Egyptians and to overthrow the dual control. There were even rumours that the foreign debt was to be repudiated. The British and French governments now decided on a fateful step, whose consequences were quite unforeseen. In May 1882, they sent an Anglo-French fleet to make a naval demonstration, that is, to appear off the coast and by its mere presence terrify the Egyptians, and thus, in the British Foreign Minister's words,
strengthen the authority of the Khedive.
They also demanded the retirement of Arabi, who was now a member of the cabinet. This ultimatum, however, simply inflamed the Egyptian nationalists. In Alexandria, a number of Europeans were killed by rioters. Arabi prepared an army to resist foreign attack and had begun to fortify Alexandria. And in July 1882, Admiral Seymour commanded the British ships to open fire on the city. Alexandria fell, British troops were landed, and in a few weeks Great Britain completed the conquest of Egypt. France, it must be noted, took no part in the bombardment or conquest. On the contrary, the French ships sailed away, and Freycinet, the French premier, fell from power when he asked the French Parliament for funds to defend the canal, for public opinion in France, mindful of the recent Tunisian scandals, was hostile to imperialism and fearful of a quarrel with England. England made a show of inviting Turkey and Italy to help, but both refused. How the British Foreign Minister, Lord Granville, felt about such refusals may be inferred from his own words, in a confidential letter.
We have shown our readiness to admit others, and we have not the inconveniences of a partner. If Arabi caves in, as appears probable, we shall be on velvet.
Less enthusiastic, in all conscience, was the British Prime Minister, none other than William Ewart Gladstone, who had been an eloquent and impassioned opponent of imperialism in general, and intervention in Egypt in particular. Against his own principles, Gladstone had been pushed into Egypt by the pressure of Foreign Office officials, financiers, and shippers, and parliamentary opinion. He had taken one step after another, hardly realising how far he would be carried. Landing troops in foreign territory is not usually considered a conventional, legal procedure, but British statesmen, always eager to cover their actions with the dignified mantle of law, represented the seizure of Egypt as a matter of justice, of legal right, of disinterested duty. Said Gladstone,
We seek the maintenance of all established rights
in Egypt,
whether they be those of the Sultan, those of the Khedive, those of the people of England, or those of foreign bondholders.
The last was not least. Said Lord Granville, England sought the
maintenance of the sovereign rights of the Sultan, of the position of the Khedive, and of the liberties of the Egyptian people under the firmans,
that is decrees,
of the Porte,
that is Turkey,
the prudent development of their institutions, and the fulfilment of all international engagements.
Dilke, the Under-Secretary for Foreign Affairs, held that intervention in Egypt would benefit the British working men through trade, but that necessity and treaty right and duty were the reasons for intervention. But treaty rights and the Sultan's rights and the Khedive's rights, like flowers that bloom in the spring, had little to do with the case. The important factors were Ireland, bonds, and the Suez Canal. Ireland, because the violence of the Irish nationalist movement at this time not only preoccupied Gladstone's mind, but made it easier for him to yield to the clamour for action against Egyptian nationalists. Bonds, because about £30 million of Egypt's debt was held in England, so Joseph Chamberlain said, and the bondholders feared that the Egyptian nationalists would repudiate the debts. Lord Cromer, of whom more will be said, bluntly declared,
"The origin of the Egyptian question in its present phase was financial."
Perhaps Gladstone and Chamberlain, however, were sincere in denying that the interest of the bondholders was the primary factor. The canal was even more important to British public men. About 80% of the shipping which passed through the canal in 1882 flew the British flag, and a considerable portion, 13% in 1881, of Britain's entire foreign trade went by way of Suez. There is convincing evidence that the canal was a factor of primary importance in Gladstone's mind and Granville's, and perhaps the clearest statement about it was made by Sir Charles Dilke, Under Secretary in charge of the Commercial Division of the Foreign Office.
"The canal is the principal highway to India, Ceylon, the Straits Settlements, and British Burma, where 250 million people live under our rule, and also China, where we have vast interests, and 84% of the external trade of that still more enormous empire. It is also one of the roads to our colonial empire in Australia and New Zealand."
To protect the canal permanently, Dilke and others believed it was necessary to control Egypt.
"The dominance of a purely military faction at Cairo must place our communications with India and the East in permanent jeopardy."
All things considered, it is not far from the truth to say conflict between foreign finance and native nationalism produced the crisis in 1882, inviting intervention, and that a desire to control the Suez Canal made British statesmen unwilling that any power other than England should occupy Egypt. As a liberal who opposed imperialism on principle, Gladstone did not intend permanent conquest when he permitted British troops to occupy Egypt. On the contrary, so at least he declared,
"Of all the things in the world, that,"
being permanent occupation,
"is the thing we are not going to do."
Great Britain formally and explicitly notified the other powers, on January 3rd, 1883, that the British Army was to be withdrawn as soon as the state of the country and the organisation of the proper means for maintenance of the Khedive's authority will admit of it. These pledges Gladstone regarded as peculiarly sacred. In his own words, August 9th, 1883, they were
"Specific and solemn pledges given to the world in the most solemn manner and under the most critical circumstances, pledges which have earned us the confidence of Europe at large during the course of difficult and delicate operations, and which, if one pledge can be more sacred than another, special sacredness in this case binds us to fulfil."
But Gladstone, though he lived to an advanced age, never fulfilled his pledge. It is difficult to abandon conquests. Subsection: British reforms and the independence of Egypt. The organisation of the proper means for the maintenance of the Khedive's authority, which, according to the British pledge, would permit England to evacuate Egypt, proved to be a long process. The Anglo-French dual control gave place to British control. A sort of constitution for Egypt was drawn up by Lord Dufferin in the winter of 1882-1883, and promulgated as the Organic Law of 1883. The Khedive was to exercise his authority through a council of ministers, with the advice and criticism of a legislative council and a general assembly, without whose consent new taxes could not be levied. The Khedive, with his ministers, council and assembly, and native officials, constituted the visible government, but the real government was a more or less invisible system of British advisers supervising and controlling every department of the administration. and taking their orders not from the Khedive, but from the British Consul General at Cairo. As British Consul General and High Commissioner, Lord Cromer was the real monarch of Egypt for a quarter century, from 1883 to 1907. At the time of his appointment, Cromer had not yet earned his peerage. He was simply Major Evelyn Baring, a colonial official who had shown great ability in financial matters and who was related to the great London bankers of the same name. He won his earldom by his remarkable achievements in Egypt, of which he has left an ample record in his 2-volume work on Modern Egypt. His first great task was
the race against bankruptcy.
For 5 years.
The issue seemed doubtful.
He writes, but soon the budget began to show a surplus, after paying interest on the debt and expenses of administration. The bondholders were saved. Another task of supreme importance was to regulate the water supply. Egypt, it must be remembered, is a practically rainless country, and the cultivated lands of the valley and delta depend absolutely on the water of the Nile. For thousands of years, Egyptian agriculturalists were at the Nile's mercy, and the great river with fickle humour gave their fields too much in some years, too little in others, of the life-giving water. Moreover, for the increasingly important crops of sugar and cotton, a regular supply of moisture, rather than an annual flood, was needed. British engineers solved the problem by constructing the great Aswan Dam, more than a mile long and 82 feet thick, to check the floods and hold a reservoir of water 200 miles long for gradual use in the dry season. By irrigation canals, this water is distributed to the thirsty fields. It is the greatest achievement of the British in Egypt. Other reforms also the British accomplished. The 3 crying evils which Lord Cromer styles
the 3 C's, the Kourbash, the corvée, and corruption,
were attacked. The Kourbash was the strip of hippopotamus hide with which the peasants were almost universally flogged. It was the favourite means of forcing labourers to work, of prompting unwilling witnesses to give evidence in judicial processes or suspected criminals to confess their faults, of persuading taxpayers to meet their due, and tenants to pay their rent. Egypt was ruled with the Kourbash until the British administration forbade its use. The corvée was compulsory labour. Each year a vast amount of labour was required, during the period when the Nile was low, to remove accumulation of mud from the bottom of the irrigation channels. The poorer peasants were compelled to do this work. In one district they had to work, without wages, 180 days in the year. As long as the Kourbash sang over their backs, they did the work, but with its abolition a new system had to be found. And though it required an additional governmental expenditure of $2 million a year, the British substituted free labour and wages for the corvée to a large extent. The third C, corruption, could not be entirely abolished, but we have Cromer's word that it
was greatly diminished.
But these were only the most conspicuous of the many reforms, some economic, some humanitarian, that were carried out. Railways were built, harbours developed, schools established, and from such reforms there can be little doubt that the fellaheen, the downtrodden peasantry, greatly profited. Saved from the whip and forced labour, protected by wise laws from grasping moneylenders, encouraged in 100 ways by a watchful government, the peasants gained greater freedom and prosperity than had ever been theirs. The welfare of the peasantry meant increased population. The population has doubled since 1882, increased agricultural production, increased imports and exports, and tax revenues. Cotton production was more than doubled, and the value of the crop rose from £9 million, Egyptian, in 1881 to 52 in 1924. Most of the cotton was exported for manufacture, England taking the largest share. Imports increased from 7 million sterling in 1881 to 43 in 1922, and most of the imports were cotton manufactures, coal and iron, and steel goods from England. Yet the Egyptian was not happy. Cromer says,
"The want of gratitude displayed by a nation to its alien benefactors is almost as old as history itself."
But ingratitude is not the only reason why British rule was unpopular. There were instances of overbearing arrogance, and unfortunately in some cases, notably the Denshawe incident, certain Englishmen felt it was necessary to display ruthlessness in punishing native antagonism. But the chief and most obvious source of trouble was that the Egyptians, as they came more and more under European influence, learned to feel a crude sort of national consciousness and longed, like every other nation, for self-government, whether it were good government or not. And in Egypt, nationalism was intensified by Mohammedan hatred of the Christian. Hoping to conciliate the natives, the British in 1913 modified the organic law and merged the Legislative Council and General Assembly into a single legislative assembly with power to propose as well as discuss legislation. But the new assembly, in its first meeting, showed a strong nationalist hostility to British domination. Then occurred the Great War of 1914. When Turkey entered the war against Great Britain, the latter took advantage of the situation to declare Egypt no longer a Turkish province, but a British protectorate in December 1914. The pro-Turkish Khedive, Abbas Hilmi, was deposed, and Hussein Kamal was given the throne, with the new title Sultan of Egypt. Thus England fulfilled the aim of safeguarding the rights of the Turkish Sultan and the authority of the Khedive. During the Great War, England ruled Egypt with a strong hand, disregarding the puppet sultan, refusing to convene the Legislative Assembly, censoring the press, and suppressing nationalist agitation. Such tactics only made more Egyptians nationalists. At the close of the war, the Egyptian leaders appointed a peace delegation to put Egypt's case before the Paris Conference and to claim the right of self-determination which Wilson and Lloyd George and other Allied orators had so eloquently proclaimed. The Egyptian delegates were quietly arrested by British police and shipped to Malta, and General Allenby, who had won splendid laurels during the war in the Near East, was sent as Special High Commissioner to prevent the ominous unrest of Egypt from developing into a full-fledged rebellion. But even Allenby could not silence the clamour for independence. Then a mission of inquiry, headed by the celebrated empire builder Lord Milner of South African fame, was sent down to Egypt. Milner returned discouraged. In London, the commission interviewed Zaghloul, leader of the Egyptian peace delegation. In its report, the commission admitted that
the spirit of Egyptian nationalism cannot be extinguished,
and recommended that England should abolish the protectorate and grant Egypt independence on certain conditions. Subsection Independent Egypt. Great Britain's recognition of Egypt as an independent sovereign state in February 1922 was clear evidence that in London the Egyptian situation was considered extremely grave. It is difficult, we repeat, to give up possessions, but England retained the rights which seemed most vital to imperial interests. 1. The right to defend the Suez Canal using Egyptian territory for military operations if necessary. 2. The right to defend Egypt against all foreign aggression or interference. 3. The right to protect foreign interests in Egypt. And 4. Control of the Anglo-Egyptian Sudan. While these matters, absolutely reserved by Great Britain, pending future discussion, were left unsettled, the Egyptians were allowed to draw up a constitution, 1923, providing for the government of Egypt as an independent constitutional monarchy, with King Fuad as sovereign, a cabinet responsible to Parliament, and a Parliament elected by the people. The formerly persecuted peace delegate, Zaghloul, the nationalist who had been imprisoned in Malta, now became Premier of Egypt, and nationalism had full sway. So exuberant were the newly emancipated people that they even ventured to insist in firm tones that the Sudan must be turned over to Egypt as her rightful heritage. One backward people hardly freed from alien rule demanded its right to rule another backward people. Such is the circular path of human logic. England, however, retained the Sudan, and General Allenby, we may add, remained in Egypt with British soldiers for all Egypt's independence. Egyptian agitation against British rule in the Sudan reached a climax with the assassination by Egyptians of General Sir Lee Stack, Governor-General of the Sudan and Sirdar, commander of the Egyptian army, on November 19, 1924. The British government seized this opportunity to insist upon the withdrawal of all Egyptian officers and troops from the Sudan, and the increase of the area to be irrigated at Jazeera in the Sudan to an unlimited figure. If this meant that Great Britain would draw off from the Nile an unlimited amount of water for the irrigation of British cotton plantations in the Sudan, it would be a grave threat to Egypt, for Egypt lives by the waters of the Nile. The British Foreign Minister, however, soon silenced criticism on this point by promising a joint inquiry as to the amount of water available for the Sudan after making full allowance for Egypt's needs. This is the story of Britain in Egypt, but not the whole story. We have not mentioned the effect on American cotton planters of the increasing cotton cultivation in Egypt, nor have we mentioned the effect of England's aggression on European peace. In January 1882, just after the Anglo-French note was delivered to Egypt, Bismarck thought it
regrettable for the general European situation to see the English cabinet gliding from one adventure into another.
And he predicted that England would have trouble with France. He had previously been inclined to favour France in the Egyptian question, but after England intervened, Herbert Bismarck told Lord Granville that Germany would not object even to annexation of Egypt by England. Granville, of course, was pleased, and Dilke, British Under-Secretary for Foreign Affairs, favoured Herbert Bismarck with such frank expressions of his views as,
"I am very much anti-French. They,"
being the French,
"behave like children."
England's intervention in Egypt in 1882 not only antagonised France, but disturbed the status quo in the Near East. Fortunately, Gladstone's promise to get out of Egypt soon reassured the other powers, and peace was preserved. But France continued to cherish her grievance, and during the next few years cooperated with Germany in opposition to England as regards African matters. In another chapter we have seen how Anglo-French rivalry reached its climax when Kitchener and Marchand met at Fashoda in 1898. It was no small part for the purpose of ending French opposition to British rule in Egypt that Great Britain formed the Entente Cordiale with France in 1904. The Anglo-French Declaration, signed on April 8, 1904, provided that France
"will not obstruct the action of Great Britain in that country,"
that is, Egypt,
by asking that a limit of time be fixed for the British occupation, or in any other matter.
France also agreed to give the British a free hand in raising the new Egyptian loans without the consent of the powers, and in disposing of the surplus revenue of Egypt, over and above the sum required for interest on the debt, which surplus had long been tied up by international agreements. In return, England agreed to equal rights in the Suez Canal for the ships of all nations. In the secret articles signed the same day, France agreed in advance to the abolition of the treaty rights which had hitherto hindered Great Britain from effecting judicial reforms in Egypt. This agreement, as the reader doubtless recalls, was part of a comprehensive set of colonial agreements, but the essential element in the complex balance of gains and concessions was the simple bargain that France would not oppose British imperialism in Egypt if England would not oppose French imperialism in Morocco. Gladstone's stumbling into Egypt in 1882 was therefore one of the reasons, perhaps the chief, why, 22 years later, Great Britain should embrace her age-long enemy in an entente cordiale, why in 1905 and 1911 Great Britain should stand ready to join France in war against Germany for Morocco, why in the Great War of 1914 Great Britain fought side by side with France and Russia. It is a tangled web that imperialism weaves. End of section 7.